In this video, we're going to learn about the major components that work together to produce a functioning eukaryotic cell and take a detailed look at what many regard as the most important of those components. Before we get there, though, we should do a survey of the major components and where they are found in the cell, starting on the outside and working our way gradually inward, which necessitates that we start with the outermost structure on the cell called the cell membrane, which is the physical barrier that surrounds the outside of the cell, protecting everything that is found inside. Now, the primary way that it does this is simply by controlling substances that can get into the cell. For example, we know that cells cannot survive without oxygen, and so the cell membrane allows this to pass. Obviously, cells will need nutrients in order for them to be able to produce energy and grow, and therefore the cell membrane will also allow nutrients into the cell, but something harmful, such as a virus, would be denied entry, and therefore the cell membrane, by restricting entry of harmful substances such as viruses, protects the vulnerable insides of the cell. Now, likewise, the cell membrane can also allow certain substances to get out of the cell if keeping them inside would be dangerous. And the best example of this is carbon dioxide that is produced whenever cells produce energy. Carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product, and so the cell will allow carbon dioxide to exit the cell. Now, if we are a substance that is able to pass through the cell membrane, we would actually enter a part of the cell that we can't immediately see, but that makes up the overwhelming majority of the mass of the cell, and this is a structure that really isn't a structure at all, that we call the cytoplasm. So cyto is a prefix that refers to the cell, so the cytoplasm is found within the cell, and plasm is actually a suffix that shares the root with the word plasma, and in the context of biology, plasma refers to anything that is made of water. For example, the liquid part of our blood is also called blood plasma. Therefore, the cytoplasm is the liquid part of the cell that makes up most of its mass, and that's why we don't really see it, because it is the clear liquid substance that is everywhere, that all of the solid structures float around within. So the cytoplasm allows the transportation of substances around the cell, because once again, the cytoplasm is simply water, so all of the solid substances are able to float around the cytoplasm and move to where they need to be. Which brings us to the solid structures that we see many of, and each of these we can see looks completely different from the others, and each of these are what we call the cell's organelles. So the root of the word organelles is obviously the word organ, and if we think of the organs of the human body, you can think of the heart, the brain, and the lungs are probably the first three that come to mind, and that's natural. The L suffix actually is what we call a diminutive suffix that just means little, so organelles are like little organs. So in the same way that your body cannot survive without a heart, without a brains, without lungs, or without any of the other organs, while each organ performs a distinct function, the little organs of the cell, the organelles, none of the organelles can survive without all of the other, because all of them work together in order to collaboratively allow the cell to perform its functions, while each specific organelle has a different function that it performs, the functions of which are the subject of future videos in this series. Although, arguably the most important organelle in the cell is this large structure that we find kind of at the center, which is what we call the nucleus. And you can remember this name because in the same way that the nucleus is the name for the center of the atom, the nucleus in cells is widely regarded as the control center of the cell, because this is where pretty much all of the DNA in the cell is located. And most people recognize that DNA is the primary control molecule that allows the rest of the cell to perform its functions. And the way that DNA works is that DNA is the central molecule that regulates the cell's ability to synthesize, that being to produce, proteins. So by DNA deciding which proteins and how much of each protein this cell produces, those proteins will then affect what the cell actually does, as proteins compose many of these structures and chemicals that are used by the cell in order to perform its function. So in the remainder of the video, we're going to take a deeper look at the structure and functions of the nucleus. So as mentioned previously, the nucleus is the home to most of the cell's DNA, and the job of the nucleus is simply to hold onto the DNA and protect your DNA, because without your DNA, the cell would not be able to decide what to do. Now, in the same way that the cell has a membrane that surrounds and protects the insides of the cell, your nucleus actually has its own membrane, and naturally we call this the nuclear membrane, although some biology textbooks will refer to this structure as the nuclear envelope instead. But whether you refer to this structure here surrounding the DNA as the nuclear membrane or the nuclear envelope, it refers to the same structure that surrounds and protects the DNA and prevents any harmful substances from being able to get at the DNA by denying them entry, in the same way that the cell membrane does. Now, if we look in the heart of the nucleus right here, we can see a very, very dense ball of DNA that is compressed on the inside, which is a structure that we call the nucleolus. And the job of the nucleolus is that it contains arguably the most important DNA for the cell. So the DNA in the nucleolus is used to make another special type of organelle, which are what we call ribosomes. And the job of ribosomes is these are the organelles that are actually used to produce the protein that the cell needs. So this is why the nucleolus is regarded as the most important component of the nucleus, and why DNA is regarded as the regulator for protein synthesis, because this DNA in the nucleolus leads to the production of ribosomes, and without ribosomes, all of the protein that exists within the cell is not able to be produced. Unfortunately, in terms of the structure and the way that the DNA is organized within the nucleolus, we don't really know a whole lot other than that, because it's very difficult to study this structure without actually destroying the DNA that makes up the inside of the nucleolus, which opens the doors for many possible future research to be done regarding how the nucleolus works. In the next video, we're going to look at the protective structures that don't just surround and protect the cell's nucleus, but surround and protect the entire cell, and how those structures function, and why certain type of cells require extra protective structures while others, such as animal cells, do not.